With the end of the last ice age around the 10th millennium BC, the environment across Southwest Asia began to warm gradually. The icy barrier that had long restricted human advancement began to retreat, releasing its hold on the lands flanking the twin rivers. In these now thawing valleys and hills, small communities of hunter-gatherers noticed an extraordinary shift. Wild varieties of wheat and barley flourished abundantly in the open. For untold generations, these people had roamed with migrating animals and gathered seasonal vegetation, carrying all they owned as they moved with nature's cycle. But now, in the midst of a transforming landscape, they started remaining in regions where food grew plentifully. The earliest habitations were modest clusters of circular huts, constructed from mud and reeds. Sites such as Tel Muribit, Abu Huraira, and Beta, today located in northern Syria, offer archaeological signs of this transition. People began establishing semi-permanent homes. Though they continued hunting gazelles and collecting wild pistachios, they began to stay rooted, returning to the same place year after year. In the Jordan Valley, one community began to grow beyond its peers. Jericho, which may be the oldest town to have been continuously lived in, rose over 11,000 years ago. Its residents constructed stone walls that served not only as houses, but also as protection, revealing the earliest evidence of collective defense systems. Mysterious towers were erected here, enigmatic structures whose original purpose remains uncertain to archaeologists. Farther northeast in Anatolia, another astonishing society was forming, Chaldean. This settlement featured mud brick homes built so tightly together that streets were unnecessary. People accessed their dwellings via openings in the rooftops, navigating their way through the mound-like community much like ants moving through a complex hive. However, the true transformation was unfolding quietly in the surrounding fields. By closely observing and selecting desirable traits, early farmers began to domesticate wild grains. They favored plants that produced bigger seeds and retained their husks. Over time, these grasses were no longer wild. They became cultivated crops. Wheat had arrived. The age of purposeful food production had dawned. Simultaneously, animals once hunted for survival were gradually brought under human control. The wild aurochs, powerful ancestors of modern cattle, were eventually tamed. Goats, sheep, and pigs were also domesticated, providing steady supplies of meat, dairy, and hides, all without relying on the uncertainty of hunting. This shift, an agricultural revolution, spread steadily across the fertile zone arching from the Persian Gulf through river valleys and toward the Mediterranean coast. This region became known as the Fertile Crescent. The change did not happen overnight, but unfolded across centuries, and its effects were revolutionary. For the first time, human communities could grow more food than they needed immediately. This surplus allowed some individuals to step away from farming and focus on other trades. A new class of specialists emerged, artisans like potters, textile makers, and tool craftsmen who exchanged their products for food. In the 6th millennium BC, another groundbreaking invention surfaced, pottery. Although containers had long been made of stone, wood, or woven fibers, the firing of clay created lightweight, waterproof vessels. These enabled better food storage and made transporting liquids easier. As agriculture improved, lowland plains between major rivers presented new difficulties. Rainfall was limited, but the seasonal flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers deposited nutrient-rich silt ideal for crops. To harness this, inhabitants began digging channels to direct water to their fields. This was the origin of organized irrigation-based farming. By the early 5th millennium BC, small farming villages were expanding across the southern floodplains. The area later known as Sumer began to take shape. Settlements like Uruk and Eridu started as agricultural hamlets, but steadily grew into early urban centers. The control and use of water became central to these communities. Irrigation demanded coordination, planning, and oversight, tasks that exceeded the capabilities of a single family or clan. Constructing canals and levees encouraged more complex social cooperation and emerging leadership structures. Farming also introduced new vulnerabilities. Food surpluses had to be safeguarded from thieves and stored for times of scarcity. Spiritual beliefs evolved in tandem with these concerns. Forces governing rain, drought, and harvest were personified into deities who needed to be appeased. Temples began as humble shrines, but gradually became more intricate. Roughly 6,000 years ago, some towns were erecting formal religious buildings where priests performed ceremonies to ensure agricultural success. These temples became hubs of not just worship, but also distribution, central locations where grain was collected and managed. Social hierarchies began to form. Those in control of surplus goods acquired influence. Priests who claimed to understand divine intentions gained authority. The relatively equal structure of early nomadic groups gave way to stratified societies led by elites. Tools and materials advanced as well. Copper, first used around 7000 BC for ornaments and beads, started to be forged into practical tools and weapons. By about 6000 BC, metalworkers had discovered that alloying copper with tin produced bronze, a harder, more resilient metal. Thus, the Bronze Age emerged. Commerce expanded widely. Sharp obsidian sourced from Anatolian volcanoes was traded over long distances. Precious lapis lazuli from Afghanistan adorned temples in southern Mesopotamia. Shells from the Persian Gulf reached inland settlements. In the later stages of the 4th millennium BC, within Uruk, yet another innovation reshaped society. To keep track of temple resources, administrators began using small clay tokens to signify specific goods. Eventually, these tokens evolved into impressions made on clay tablets. The world's earliest writing system was born. At first, these marks were simple pictorial representations. A sheep drawing stood for one sheep. Several marks indicated multiples. Over time, this evolved. Symbols came to represent sounds rather than just objects. True writing had emerged. By the early 4th millennium BC, the essential foundations of civilization were already laid. Cities housing thousands, skilled artisans, and labor divisions, large-scale architecture, complex religious institutions, social ranking, distant trade routes, and written communication. Human history had crossed a critical threshold. The era of organized civilization had truly begun. In the southern lowlands where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers neared the coastline, a transformative human endeavor unfolded. This region, defined by its swampy estuaries and nutrient-rich farmland, became the setting for humanity's earliest civilization of true cities. Within this lush but challenging environment, a new societal model emerged, an interconnected landscape of authentic urban centers enclosed by sun-baked clay walls, each supporting thousands of inhabitants. Among them, Uruk stood out as a shining beacon. After 3500 BCE, it expanded dramatically, eventually spanning almost 250 hectares and potentially sheltering up to 50,000 individuals. At its zenith, Uruk boasted monumental fortifications and a tightly packed urban fabric of dwellings, artisan shops, marketplaces, and administrative centers. Dominating the city's heart was a sacred marvel, the White Temple, elevated on a massive platform. Resembling a man-made mountain on the otherwise level plains, its white plastered exterior sparkled under the intense sun, making it visible across great distances. This elevated base, an early form of what would later be known as a ziggurat, symbolized both technical sophistication and religious commitment. Other cities soon arose across the floodplain, many once hugging the ancient shoreline, now displaced inland due to centuries of river silt accumulation. One such city was Eridu, hailed in regional lore as the oldest settlement. It featured a prominent sanctuary dedicated to Enki, the divine figure associated with wisdom and fresh water. Additional urban powers, Lagish, Kish, Nippur, and Umma, each flourished with distinct political lineages and patron deities. Far from being oversized villages, these city-states introduced a new form of social complexity. Unlike earlier communities, their populations included a wide array of specialists, artisans, metalworkers, potters, traders, government officials, soldiers, and clergy. This intricate society was mirrored in the built environment. Elaborate temples, government halls, opulent residences for the elite, and humble abodes for the general population defined their skylines. Over time, sacred buildings grew in scale and complexity, evolving from simple one-room sanctuaries into sprawling, elevated complexes. Though early ziggurats lacked the later stepped appearance, they nonetheless asserted dominance over the urban landscape. By 3000 BCE, one such city had constructed a temple platform rising more than 11 meters, utilizing over 720,000 fired bricks. This massive feat of labor raised another important question: who organized such immense undertakings? The answer lies in the emergence of structured political leadership. Governance initially appeared to be collaborative. Councils of elders and civic assemblies held sway, but over time, religious leaders, custodians of temple wealth, assumed expanded influence. These individuals, later known as in or priest kings, were seen as conduits between humanity and the divine. During periods of turmoil, such as war or natural disaster, a military leader, or lugal meaning great man, might be temporarily elevated. In some instances, these war leaders transitioned their authority into hereditary kingship, gradually displacing the religious elite. By around 2900 BCE, monarchies had solidified in many cities. Though kings were not yet worshipped as gods, they asserted divine approval for their rule. Burial sites from this era illustrate their wealth and status. Golden cups, ornate ornaments, musical instruments, and the remains of sacrificed attendants accompanied rulers into the afterlife. Religion infused every corner of public and private life. Each city elevated a particular deity to preeminence, and while numerous gods filled the pantheon, several stood above the rest. Enlil, the sky god and bringer of storms; Enki, lord of wisdom and water; and Inanna, goddess of love and warfare, were central figures. These gods were imagined with human-like emotions and desires, but possessed immense power. Temples served as homes to these celestial beings, where rituals and daily offerings, food, drink, and fragrant incense were provided by priests to placate the divine. The fear was clear. Without devotion, the gods might retaliate through floods, famines, or enemy invasions. The cosmos itself was understood as a flat disk topped by a firmament of sky, with a gloomy netherworld beneath where souls lingered in a faded reflection of life. Unlike later religious systems, there was no heavenly reward for virtue. Death awaited all, and the afterlife promised little beyond survival in shadow. This civilization blended empirical knowledge with spiritual belief. Medical papyri from the time show an advanced understanding of the human body and treatments, but illnesses were still often attributed to angry deities or demonic forces. Likewise, although astronomy was developed to track seasons and time for both farming and religious ceremonies, celestial anomalies were interpreted as messages from the gods. One of this society's most enduring legacies was its invention and refinement of writing. Cuneiform, which originated from rudimentary pictographs used for tallying goods, evolved into a full script capable of recording language and abstract thought. By 2500 BCE, scribes utilized over 600 symbols to write not only inventories, but also legal codes, correspondence, medical recipes, and poetry. Literacy was restricted to a trained class of scribes. Young boys from elite families began their education around age 7 in institutions called tablet houses. Years of rigorous study were required to master the intricate script. These literati held influential roles in temples, courts, and commercial institutions. Linguistically, the language of Sumer is a puzzle. It does not belong to the Semitic or Indo-European language families, making it a linguistic isolate. Nevertheless, its grammar and phonetics were preserved thanks to the durable medium of cuneiform, later adapted by neighboring cultures. A vast trove of clay tablets preserves the literary richness of Sumer. The most famous work is the Epic of Gilgamesh, rooted in the adventures of a real king of Uruk from around 2700 BCE. The tale recounts his journey in pursuit of eternal life after the death of his close companion, culminating in the realization that mortality is inescapable. Other texts delve into creation myths, divine praise, and ethical teachings. One Piece, Man and His God, contemplates why misfortune befalls the innocent, echoing themes later explored in the Hebrew book of Job. Legal traditions also took root here. Though Hammurabi's code came centuries later, earlier statutes from around 2400 BCE already showed a commitment to justice and order. The laws of Ur-Nanch, formerly referred to as the laws of ornament, introduced compensatory fines for injury rather than bodily revenge, foreshadowing the eye for an eye doctrine. Economic operations revolved around central institutions, the temples and royal households. These entities managed immense landholdings, employing legions of agricultural workers, herders, and textile producers. Detailed accounting systems emerged to track resources, loans, and payments. Yet private enterprise thrived too. Merchant families embarked on long-distance ventures, trading foodstuffs and handicrafts for lumber, metals, and luxury goods. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, trade spanned a vast region, reaching the Indus Valley in present-day Pakistan, the highlands of Iran and Afghanistan, Anatolia, and the Persian Gulf. Technological progress surged. The potter's wheel, introduced around 3500 BCE, transformed ceramic production. Wheeled carts, first used by roughly 3200 BCE, improved transport. Bronze tools and weapons increased in quality. Mathematical developments included a base 60 system, the ancestor of our 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles. Despite the rise of cities, most people still lived as farmers on the outskirts or within rural villages. Agriculture advanced with new plows, irrigation techniques, and measures to combat soil salinization caused by overwatering. Urban growth intensified social stratification. At the pinnacle stood monarchs, clergy, and aristocrats. They were followed by literate professionals, scribes, merchants, and skilled artisans. Below them labored common workers and household servants. At the bottom were slaves, typically debtors or war captives, though slavery was less widespread than in some later societies and often temporary. Women held a relatively elevated position compared to those in many later cultures. They could possess property, manage enterprises, and even hold positions as priestesses or scribes. However, top political and religious roles remained male-dominated. Marriages were arranged, often involving a payment to the bride's family. Divorce was permissible for both sexes, though men retained more freedom in this respect. The Sumerian city-states frequently engaged in rivalry and skirmishes. Disputes over irrigation rights, trade access, or border demarcations often led to conflict. Around 2500 BCE, Lugalza-Gessi of Umma temporarily consolidated much of the southern plain under his rule. But this unity was short-lived. By 2334 BCE, a profound transformation loomed. The era of independent city-states, though rich in culture and innovation, had left the region politically fractured. To the north, near modern-day Baghdad, a new leader emerged, Sargon of Akkad, who would forge history's first true empire. Though Sumer's political independence faded, its legacy endured. Successor civilizations adopted and adapted its religious ideology, artistic styles, written language, and scientific knowledge. For thousands of years, the spirit of Sumer continued to echo through the halls of Mesopotamian history. In the northern regions beyond the early Sumerian city-states, a different society was taking shape across the central Mesopotamian plains. This group communicated in a Semitic tongue, setting them apart from the isolated linguistic traditions of their southern neighbors. While clearly influenced by the cultural accomplishments of Sumer, they maintained a separate identity rooted in their own evolving traditions. At the heart of this emerging power stood the enigmatic city of Akkad, whose exact location remains unidentified by modern archaeologists, though it is believed to have been near today's Baghdad. From this mysterious city would rise a transformative figure who would reshape the political structure of the ancient Near East, Sargon, whose name translates to legitimate king in his native language. The beginnings of Sargon's life are veiled in myth. According to inscriptions he left behind, he came from modest origins, the child of a gardener or date grower. Later legends even claimed he was a foundling, placed in a basket and set adrift on the Euphrates River, a story reminiscent of the later biblical tale of Moses. Regardless of the truth behind his birth, Sargon's early career began in the royal court of Kish, a significant city in northern Mesopotamia, where he served as cupbearer to the king. From this seemingly minor position, he displayed remarkable leadership and strategic acumen. Around 2334 BCE, he seized control of Kish under circumstances that remain unclear to historians. Having secured a power base, he turned his attention to the resource-rich cities of the south. Sargon's major southern adversary was Lugal-Zaggisi of Uruk, a ruler who had briefly succeeded in uniting several southern city-states under his authority. Their confrontation went beyond a simple rivalry. It was a collision of ideologies. Lugal-Zaggisi aimed to preserve the traditional network of city-states, with himself at the apex. Sargon, however, sought to create something entirely new, a territorially unified state governed by centralized authority. Through a series of campaigns, Sargon defeated Lugal-Zaggisi and his allies. One inscription boasts that he washed his weapons in the sea, implying his forces reached the shores of the Persian Gulf. Following his victories, Sargon introduced a revolutionary administrative model. Rather than letting the conquered cities retain their local rulers in exchange for tribute, Sargon replaced them with loyal administrators, frequently members of his own household. This strategy laid the groundwork for what is recognized as the world's first empire, a unified, multi-ethnic realm governed by central authority. At its peak, this empire extended from the Gulf to the Mediterranean, encompassing vast regions including parts of modern-day Syria, Turkey, and Iran. To ensure cohesion across such a broad territory, Sargon instituted several key reforms. He declared his own language the official medium for governmental affairs and standardized weights and measures to streamline trade and taxation. Crucially, he assembled a professional standing army, reportedly consisting of 5,400 troops who ate bread before him daily, a force personally loyal to the monarch rather than regional powers. The Akkadian economy was anchored in surplus agricultural production, gathered through taxation, control over trade corridors, and the spoils of conquered urban centers. Trade expanded greatly under the security of empire, reaching new distances by land and sea. Akkadian merchants journeyed to the Indus Valley and Central Asia, seeking valuable goods like lapis lazuli, carnelian, and tin. For the average citizen, imperial rule brought both advances and hardships. Peace and regulation promoted commerce and cross-cultural contact. New irrigation systems boosted crop yields in some areas. Yet burdens were significant. Heavy taxation and forced labor for grand construction or military service were common. Those who resisted imperial rule faced severe reprisals, including demolished city defenses and mass relocations. Sargon is believed to have ruled for about 56 years, though some of that duration may include the reigns of his descendants. His long tenure allowed the empire's institutions to become deeply rooted. When he died around 2279 BCE, he left behind a political order vastly different from the city-state system. that had preceded him. Independent urban centers had given way to an era dominated by empire. Sargon's sons, Raimush and Manishtushu, inherited an uneasy throne. Their rule was marked by persistent uprisings, and both met violent ends, likely through assassination. The next great figure was Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, who assumed power around 2254 BCE. He expanded upon his grandfather's legacy, both administratively and militarily. When a widespread revolt broke out among major cities, Naram-Sin responded with uncompromising force, reasserting control and restoring the empire. Following these triumphs, he made a bold political move. He declared himself divine. Previous monarchs had portrayed themselves as divinely sanctioned, but Naram-Sin went further. He adopted the divine determinative, a cuneiform sign typically reserved for gods, in inscriptions of his name. Official imagery showed him adorned with the horned crown, a symbol of the gods. This divine elevation emphasized both his immense power and perhaps a political effort to unify a diverse population under a single celestial ruler. Naram-Sin's reign marked the peak of imperial dominance. His famed victory stele, discovered in modern-day Iran at Susa, depicts him as a giant, literally larger than the soldiers around him, crushing his enemies underfoot. The artistic styles developed during this era, portraying rulers as superhuman, would resonate across the Near East for generations. Despite the empire's might, its vastness posed growing challenges. With only primitive transport and communication systems, keeping such an enormous territory under control was increasingly difficult. Regional governors, often royal relatives, built their own power networks. The financial demands of endless campaigns drained the economy. External threats also grew. Naram-Sin's inscriptions describe confrontations with the Gudi, a mountain people raiding from the Zagros range. From the west, the growing power of Ebla in Syria added pressure. After Naram-Sin's death around 2218 BCE, his son Shar-Kali Shari inherited an increasingly unstable realm. Though competent, he could not contain the forces pulling the empire apart. Provincial breakaways, foreign incursions, and economic woes multiplied. One later text dramatically captures the chaos of this period with the line, "Who was king? Who was not king?" A poetic depiction of disorder and contested rule. This era of confusion persisted until around 2154 BCE, when the final ruler of the Akkadian line was overthrown, ending the empire. Ancient tradition blamed this collapse on divine retribution for Naram-Sin's arrogance and his sacrilegious sacking of the holy city Nippur. Modern scholars point to more tangible causes: environmental degradation due to overfarming, the difficulty of administrating a sprawling empire, persistent military threats, and economic fatigue. Following the empire's fall, new powers emerged throughout the region. Southern cities re-established local governance, while the Gudi seized parts of the former imperial core. Though the empire was gone, its cultural imprint remained. The blend of northern Akkadian and southern Sumerian traditions formed a new Mesopotamian identity. The concept of empire, a single ruler uniting many peoples, became a powerful ideal for future leaders. Sargon's dynasty maintained its legendary status for centuries, with later rulers, including Assyrian kings nearly 2 millennia later, claiming descent to justify their authority. Even though the Akkadian Empire lasted less than 200 years, its innovations in governance, culture, and ideology shaped future civilizations. Its example became the prototype for imperial rule, not only in Mesopotamia, but across the ancient world. After the disintegration of the earliest empire in recorded history, Mesopotamia fractured into smaller, disconnected regions. The highland tribes, often labeled as mountain raiders, asserted dominance over the northern territories, while the southern city-states reclaimed autonomy under native leadership. This fragmented era of regional isolation endured for almost 100 years. The Gutians, portrayed in contemporary writings as savage mountain creatures devoid of discipline, loosely held the north without instituting complex systems of administration. Their dominion was marked more by plundering and the extraction of tribute than by structured rule, gradually earning the resentment of the settled inhabitants under their sway. At the same time, southern Mesopotamia began to witness a striking cultural revival. Free from Gutian influence, but still drawing from the unified traditions of the preceding imperial age, its ancient urban centers began a new era of artistic and religious rejuvenation. Historians refer to this epoch as the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance, during which older traditions found renewed expression within evolving political frameworks. Among the rejuvenated cities, Lagish rose to particular prominence under a leader named Gudea. Although he did not aim to forge a vast dominion, Gudea presided over a golden age of architectural splendor, artistic advancement, and spiritual devotion. Numerous statues of him survive, often portraying him in prayerful poses with clasped hands. These figures, sculpted from diorite, an exceptionally hard stone sourced from afar, reflect both the artistry of the time and far-reaching trade networks. Gudea's inscriptions describe grand temple building initiatives and intense piety. One such text recounts a visionary dream in which the deity Ningirsu instructed him to construct a temple, complete with divine design specifications. This account stands as one of the longest religious narratives from the era and offers a rare glimpse into theological planning and architecture. While Lagish experienced a cultural zenith, political unification was achieved elsewhere. Near the Persian Gulf, the city of became the nucleus of a new dynasty founded by Namu around 2112 BCE. A strategic and capable ruler, Namu successfully expelled the Gutians from the north and restored unity across much of the former empire, albeit on a more modest scale. In contrast to earlier rulers who consolidated power through warfare and coercion, Namu became renowned for his legal and civic reforms. His law code, although only partially recovered, is the earliest known structured legal document in history, predating Hammurabi's famous code by over 300 years. This groundbreaking legal compilation introduced fixed monetary penalties in place of corporal punishments and aimed to protect vulnerable populations such as widows, orphans, and the impoverished. One striking aspect of the code is its inclusion of early transportation regulations, laying down right-of-way rules for boats navigating the canals. In addition to legal reforms, Namu launched vast construction projects across his dominion. His most iconic achievement was the erection of monumental ziggurats, colossal step temples that towered over the plains. The ziggurat of the best preserved example, rose in 3 tiers to an approximate height of 30 meters and was reached by 3 grand stairways. These architectural marvels, visible for miles across the lowland terrain, symbolized a rebirth of religious devotion and civic pride. Administrative practices during this time became more refined, blending centralized oversight with localized governance. Provincial governors managed regional matters, while a detailed bureaucratic system ensured the collection and redistribution of agricultural and manufactured goods. Government emissaries conducted regular inspections, and a network of messengers relayed official communications between administrative hubs. Namu's son, Shulgi, inherited the throne and ruled for an extraordinary 48 years, during which the state attained its peak in efficiency and prosperity. Shulgi introduced many reforms, standardizing the calendar, unifying weights and measures, developing a royal postal system with dedicated relay stations, overhauling the tax system, and streamlining scribal education. To enhance his image, Shulgi claimed feats that emphasized his divine favor and dedication. One such claim was that he personally delivered ritual offerings between major temples over a 100-mile stretch in a single day. Whether literal or symbolic, this story highlighted his commitment to binding the kingdom cities into a unified spiritual and political whole. Later in his rule, Shulgi proclaimed himself divine, continuing a tradition set by earlier monarchs. Temples devoted to his worship were built across the land, and his name was inscribed with the cuneiform determinative for deity. This self-deification aimed to establish a theological basis for unity among traditionally autonomous cities. The economy of this flourishing period combined state direction with private enterprise. Government-run agricultural estates employed thousands and were responsible for large-scale production and distribution. In parallel, enormous textile workshops staffed by hundreds of women produced garments for both domestic use and trade. Private merchants also engaged in trade, often under royal license, linking Mesopotamia with faraway regions. Culturally, the era saw a revival of the classical Sumerian language, especially in religious and literary contexts. Educational centers for scribes thrived, ensuring the preservation and standardization of foundational texts. Many works that later came to be seen as literary masterpieces were compiled or refined during this period, including cosmogonies, hymns to deities, royal praises, and didactic literature. A particularly novel genre to emerge was the royal love poem. These lyrical pieces celebrated romantic unions between kings and the goddess Inanna, blending theology with sensual imagery. Such compositions served to sanctify royal authority through divine association. In one hymn, Shulgi is described as Inanna's beloved spouse, aligning his reign with both cosmic and earthly harmony. Foreign relations during this era included diplomacy and warfare. Interdynastic marriages solidified alliances, while trade extended to remote lands, bringing valuable imports from places as distant as the Indus Valley and Afghanistan. Military campaigns were launched to secure borders and protect trade routes, particularly against nomadic groups from the eastern deserts and nearby highlands. The stability achieved during Shulgi's reign gradually unraveled under his successors. Ibbi-Sin, the final monarch of the dynasty, confronted multiple threats. Provincial governors began asserting independence, withholding resources, and eventually proclaiming sovereignty. Nomadic tribes infiltrated western regions, settling in areas that had long been dominated by urban civilization. Compounding these issues were environmental stresses. The ancient irrigation systems that sustained the agricultural heartland began to fail due to drought and soil salinization, a process caused by prolonged irrigation in arid conditions that leads to salt accumulation in the soil, ultimately degrading fertility. Texts from the period report severe inflation in grain prices, reflecting acute agricultural distress. A letter from Ibbi-Sin to a provincial governor named Ispiera reveals the worsening crisis. The governor complained of being unable to send grain due to attacks from enemies, likely a combination of rebellious subjects and external nomadic raiders. Eventually, Ispiera declared independence, establishing his own regime in the city of Isin. The ultimate collapse came with the invasion of Elam, a growing power located in what is now southwestern Iran. In alliance with other discontented factions, Elamite forces captured around 2004 BCE. The city was sacked, its sacred ziggurat defiled, and Ibbi-Sin was taken in chains to Elam, where he likely died in captivity. A surviving lamentation poem mourns the fall of in haunting terms. The city is disgraced. Its people wander like shadows. The storerooms are plundered. The Euphrates, once a source of life, now carries the dead. This literary text combines factual narrative with theological interpretation, portraying the catastrophe as divine punishment for human transgressions. Though the political order crumbled, the cultural legacy of this brilliant age endured. Its laws, literature, administrative innovations, and monumental architecture continued to shape Mesopotamian civilization for centuries. With the fall of one dynasty, a new chapter was already beginning in the ever-evolving story of the lands between the rivers. Following the demise of the dynasty of Isin, Mesopotamia fractured into a mosaic of rival city-states, each struggling to assert dominance. With no centralized authority to unify the region, a loose network of minor realms competed for control over critical trade arteries, water supplies, and fertile lands. This prolonged era of fragmentation, spanning nearly 100 years, witnessed the rise of several influential local powers, notably in Larsa to the east, as well as Ashnuna and Mari. This political splintering coincided with a major population shift. The Amorites, a semi-nomadic people hailing from the Syrian desert, had been gradually migrating into the Fertile Crescent for generations. Their language, a branch of Western Semitic, was distinct from both the archaic Southern tongue and the Eastern Semitic speech of the earlier empires. These newcomers began to establish their own ruling lines in multiple urban centers. Among them was a tribal chief named Sumuabum, who settled in a relatively insignificant town called Babylon. By approximately 1894 BCE, Babylon, positioned along the central Euphrates, had existed for centuries with minimal distinction. Its name, meaning Gate of the Gods, had long surpassed its actual importance. Yet under Amorite rule, the city would slowly rise to a position of immense significance during its first century. In its early days under Amorite kingship, Babylon was just one contender among many. The initial 5 monarchs of the dynasty incrementally expanded their realm, constructing defensive walls, places of worship, and irrigation systems to enhance their modest dominion. Still, cities like Larsa and Ashnuna possessed greater influence and resources during this formative stage. The regional balance shifted drastically when the sixth king of the line came to power, a ruler who would not only elevate Babylon, but redefine Mesopotamian supremacy through conquest, bureaucratic skill, and strategic self-presentation. Ascending to the throne around 1792 BCE, Hammurabi ruled for 43 years, cementing Babylon's supremacy across the land. At the beginning of his reign, Hammurabi prioritized internal reform. He strengthened economic infrastructure, improved irrigation channels, restored temples, and fortified the capital's defenses. Diplomatically, he maintained cordial ties with neighboring states, often acting as a neutral arbitrator while refraining from open conflict until his own power was secured. Midway through his reign, with Babylon's foundations firmly established, Hammurabi initiated a calculated series of military campaigns that dismantled his rivals one by one. He began in the south, targeting Uruk and Isin, and extended his grasp steadily from there. Each conquered territory was absorbed into the kingdom through systematic governance and integration. Major powers soon fell before Babylonian forces: Larsa in the south, Ashnuna in the Diyala Basin, Mari along the mid-Euphrates, and eventually Ashur to the north, which would later become the heart of the Assyrian realm. By the end of these campaigns, Hammurabi had reunited Mesopotamia under a single authority for the first time since the fall of the earlier Sumerian Empire, nearly 500 years earlier. Unlike some earlier conquerors who touted their rule as revolutionary, Hammurabi styled himself as a reviver of time-honored traditions. His royal text depicted him as a shepherd appointed by the gods to bring fairness and order to the land, one who tamed the 4 quarters of the world. This devotion to justice reached its apex in his most iconic legacy, a codified body of laws. The famed Code of Hammurabi, engraved on a 2.25-meter basalt stele crown with an image of the king receiving divine mandate from Shamash, the sun deity, contained 282 decrees regulating nearly all areas of life. Discovered by archaeologists in 1901, it remains among the most comprehensive legal documents of antiquity. These statutes outlined a society stratified by class. Penalties varied based on whether one was a noble, a free citizen, or a slave. The famous eye for an eye rule applied to equals, while fines were imposed when higher-ranked individuals harmed those of lesser status. Despite its hierarchical nature, the code repeatedly stressed safeguarding the weak, orphans, widows, and the poor from exploitation. Topics within the code ranged from family law and inheritance to trade, labor, and professional standards. While remembered as a legislative figure, Hammurabi was equally meticulous in administration. His regime tracked agricultural yields, labor usage, and state resources. Officials managed irrigation networks, designated plots of land, fixed commodity prices, and regulated commercial exchange. Numerous surviving letters dictated by the king himself reveal a ruler involved in all aspects of governance, from resolving rural complaints and rooting out corruption to organizing temple rituals and overseeing construction projects. This hands-on style merged broad strategic vision with close attention to detail. Religiously, Hammurabi elevated Marduk, Babylon's local deity, to a central place in the pantheon, while still venerating other traditional gods like Enlil, Shamash, and Ishtar. Propaganda emphasized Marduk as king of the gods, aligning with Babylon's newfound supremacy. The king's divine legitimacy was underscored in text, though he avoided claiming godhood himself. The prologue to his legal code described him as divinely chosen by Anu and Enlil to ensure justice prevailed. This careful balance of divine favor and earthly responsibility shaped the royal image in Babylonian ideology. When Hammurabi passed around 1750 BCE, he left behind a united realm that encompassed nearly all of Mesopotamia. His son, Samsu-Iluna, inherited what appeared to be a stable kingdom, but the calm was short-lived. Within a few years, revolts broke out in the culturally ancient southern cities. Though initially quelled, unrest persisted, undermining central authority. Simultaneously, a new adversary emerged in the marshes of the extreme south. Known as the Sealand dynasty, this group took hold of the coastal lowlands and began capturing former Babylonian strongholds. At the same time, tribes from the Zagros Mountains began attacking from the east. Facing pressure on all fronts, Babylon's control shrank. By 1700 BCE, just half a century after Hammurabi's death, much of the southern territory had been lost. Although the dynasty retained the heartland of central Mesopotamia, the once vast empire was never fully reclaimed. Nonetheless, Babylon itself flourished. The city expanded to encompass about 450 hectares, housing an estimated 60,000 to 80,000 residents. Its religious temples, royal complexes, and bustling marketplaces made it one of the premier metropolises of the ancient world. Even amid political contraction, Babylon became a cultural powerhouse. This era saw a revival and refinement of older intellectual traditions. Scribes copied and conserved ancient literature, scientific texts, and religious works. The Babylonian dialect of Akkadian became the standard diplomatic language throughout the Near East. Scholars excelled especially in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Babylonian star watchers charted the heavens and devised the earliest predictive models of planetary motion. Mathematicians developed a sophisticated numeral system capable of handling complex calculations, including fractions, roots, and quadratic equations. This cultural flowering lasted for nearly 200 years after Hammurabi, with the dynasty maintaining inner stability even as external lands slipped away. Then, around 1595 BCE, disaster struck from an unexpected quarter. A formidable new force, the Hittites, an Indo-European group from central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, launched a surprise raid. Their king, Mursili led troops on a daring march of over 500 miles. Babylon, focused on threats from the south and east, was wholly unprepared for this northern assault. The invaders smashed through the city's defenses, looted its treasures, and brought down the Amorite dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries. The Hittites did not stay to govern, withdrawing with their spoils to Anatolia. Into the power vacuum stepped another group with growing presence in northern Mesopotamia, the Kassites. Originating from the Zagros highlands, these people had long served as mercenaries and settlers within Babylonian domains. After the Hittite withdrawal, Kassite leaders assumed control, founding a new dynasty that would endure for 400 years. Despite the regime change, cultural continuity remained intact. The Kassites adopted Babylonian customs, upheld traditional religion and language, and preserved administrative systems. Literary, religious, and architectural practices carried on uninterrupted. In the centuries that followed, the era of Hammurabi came to be remembered as a golden epoch, an age of unity, equity, and prosperity centered around a city that would remain Mesopotamia's cultural soul for generations to come. In the aftermath of Assyria's downfall, a resurgent Babylon emerged from the shadows to craft one final, radiant chapter in the saga of Mesopotamian civilization. Known as the Neo-Babylonian or Chaldean Empire, this short-lived state, lasting under a century, left an enduring cultural and historical impact that immortalized Babylon in the global imagination. This cultural renaissance began under the leadership of Nabopolassar, a figure from the Chaldean tribes that had established themselves in southern Mesopotamia, exploiting Assyria's weakening grip on the region. In 626 BCE, he proclaimed autonomy and gradually unified the southern territories. A tactical alliance with the Medes provided the military backing necessary to directly challenge Assyrian supremacy, culminating in the dramatic downfall of Nineveh in 612 BCE and the unraveling of the Assyrian state. With the empire in ruins, Nabopolassar faced the enormous task of reconstructing a land ravaged by centuries of foreign control. He launched extensive urban renovation projects, overhauled bureaucratic structures, and managed tensions between entrenched Babylonian elites and his own tribal supporters. By his death in 605 BCE, he had laid the political and administrative groundwork for an enduring legacy, which his son would expand into a golden age. That successor was Nebuchadnezzar II, whose 43-year reign would elevate Babylon to unprecedented glory. Ascending the throne with a reputation already forged in battle, having commanded forces against Egypt, he wasted no time solidifying the empire's western frontiers. His campaigns extended Babylonian influence into Syria and as far as the Egyptian frontier. One of the most consequential events of his rule was the siege of Jerusalem in 597 BCE, followed by a more forceful conquest in 587 BCE, which resulted in the destruction of the First Temple and the exile of Judah's ruling class to Babylon. This moment of profound trauma in Jewish history is immortalized in biblical writings. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. With military stability secured, Nebuchadnezzar shifted focus inward, initiating massive construction efforts and urban transformation. The empire's wealth, drawn from taxation, commerce, and agriculture, financed an ambitious architectural program that would make Babylon one of antiquity's most spectacular cities. Though already venerable, with roots reaching back nearly 2,000 years, Nebuchadnezzar reimagined the capital on a staggering scale. Towering defensive walls, so wide that chariots could wheel around atop them, encircled a sprawling city of more than 850 hectares. The Euphrates River, running through the city's center, was managed by a sophisticated system of canals and harbors. Grand avenues paved with limestone and adorned with colorful glazed brick murals of lions, bulls, and dragons linked key religious and governmental districts. At the heart of the city stood a sacred precinct devoted to Marduk, Babylon's chief deity. Central to this complex was the enormous ziggurat known as Edamananke, constructed in 7 colored layers and soaring over 90 meters, widely believed to have inspired the biblical Tower of Babel. Adjacent to it was Marduk's grand temple, which housed his golden idol and spoils from foreign conquests. Equally majestic was the royal palace, a vast complex of ceremonial courts, halls of audience, and administrative buildings, forming a self-contained urban domain. According to later Greek accounts, it was here that Nebuchadnezzar constructed the legendary Hanging Gardens, tiered, irrigated terraces filled with exotic flora, said to have been built for his Median queen, who longed for the lush landscape of her native highlands. Though the physical evidence remains elusive, the very notion of the gardens became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, highlighting Babylon's mythical hold on the human imagination. Among the most elaborate rituals of Babylonian life was the annual New Year festival, an 11-day spectacle that combined religious devotion with political theater. During the celebrations, the mythic epic Enuma Elish, recounting Marduk's cosmic victory over chaos, was recited. In a climactic rite, the king submitted symbolically to divine authority. The high priest would slap the king's face and force him to prostrate before Marduk's statue, a ritual designed to affirm that earthly rule was subordinate to heavenly will. Outside the capital, Nebuchadnezzar launched a vast program of public works across the empire. He revitalized irrigation networks to boost farming yields, restored temples in historic religious centers such as Ur and Nippur, and fortified key trade corridors with military posts and rest stations. These efforts brought economic recovery and cultural revival to a region long destabilized by the chaos of Assyria's final years. Intellectually, the Chaldean era marked a high point in Mesopotamian science, especially in the field of astronomy. Court astronomers refined observational methods honed over generations, achieving remarkable accuracy in forecasting celestial phenomena. While these studies were driven by religious concerns, divining the gods' will from the stars, the precision of their calculations would later influence scientific astronomy. Literary traditions also flourished. Scribes preserved ancient works while composing new texts. The definitive version of the Babylonian creation story took shape at this time, harmonizing earlier fragments into a unified theological statement on divine kingship and cosmic order. Chronicles documented royal achievements, while instructional texts passed on practical knowledge in medicine, engineering, and law. A trove of administrative records reveals a sophisticated economy where temple and palace networks managed vast estates, artisan workshops, and commercial ventures. At the same time, private merchants and families engaged in independent trade and finance, some even founding influential banking operations that provided loans and credit for agriculture and commerce. When Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BCE, the cracks in the empire's foundation became evident. The lack of institutional mechanisms for succession and governance beyond a dominant ruler proved destabilizing. His heir, Amel-Marduk, referred to as Evil Merodach in biblical accounts, was soon ousted by Neriglissar, a military commander linked to the royal family by marriage. Following Neriglissar's brief reign, his young son was swiftly removed in favor of Nabonidus, a ruler of uncertain lineage who would become Babylon's final native king. Nabonidus pursued policies that alienated the traditional power structures. His unusual devotion to Sin, the moon god, unsettled the influential priesthood of Marduk. Even more striking was his decade-long absence from the capital, during which he resided in the Arabian oasis of Tema, leaving his son Belshazzar to govern in his stead. The reasons for this absence remain debated, ranging from commercial to religious or health-related concerns, but it undermined central authority and stirred resentment among the elite classes. Discontent grew among the Marduk priesthood, noble families, and urban leaders who viewed his rule as a deviation from sacred tradition and neglect of civic ritual. Meanwhile, a new power was ascending to the east. The Persian king Cyrus II, later known as Cyrus the Great, had unified Iran under his command, dethroning the Median kings and forging a rising imperial force. By 539 BCE, Persian armies reached Babylon's gates after subduing its outlying defenses. The biblical account speaks of revelry interrupted by divine judgment, the writing on the wall interpreted by the prophet Daniel. But Babylon's fall, as recorded in archaeological and Persian sources, was more subdued. The city yielded with little conflict, and Cyrus entered as a liberator rather than a destroyer. In the famed Cyrus cylinder, unearthed by modern excavators, the Persian monarch portrayed himself as Marduk's chosen servant tasked with restoring proper worship and justice after Nabonidus perceived failings. Whether driven by divine mission or political strategy, this peaceful conquest preserved the city's splendor even as it brought Babylonian independence to an end. The Neo-Babylonian Empire thus became a prosperous province within the expanding Persian realm. introducing new forms of multicultural administration. This marked the closing chapter of autonomous Mesopotamian rule. While Babylon would remain a vital center of governance and culture under successive empires, Persian, Greek, and Parthian, its homegrown political tradition had come to a final close. Yet the legacy of this brilliant but fleeting Chaldean revival would live on, not only in ruins and relics, but in myth, scripture, and legend. From biblical tales of exile and prophecy to classical writings and the enduring fascination with Babylon's grandeur, this epic would echo across the ages in imagination and memory.